The word bulldozer is older than the bulldozer, not by a little, by 47 years. In 1876 in Louisiana, a bulldozer was a man. In East Feliciana Parish that November, there were 2,127 registered Republican voters. Exactly one Republican vote was counted. That June, in nearby Port Hudson, a black preacher named Minor Holmes was hauled into his own Baptist church by men in black masks and goggles and hanged from the wooden beams. They cut him down before he died. That was the point. He was supposed to live and tell people. Those men called themselves bulldozers. There was no machine. There was no blade, no engine, no steel. There was only the name. The word came first. The machine spent the next 100 years earning it. The machine that would take that name was 47 years away, and it started with a farmer in Kansas who needed to fill in a ditch. To understand how a word for terror ends up painted on a tractor, you have to understand how fast it spread. The election of 1876 was Rutherford Hayes against Samuel Tilden, and on election night, Tilden led Louisiana by more than 6,000 votes. The state's returning board threw out roughly 13,000 Democratic ballots on the grounds that whole parishes had been terrorized into voting the way they voted. They had a word for it already, because everyone did. The explanation printed in newspapers that autumn was that a bulldoze was a dose of the whip fit for a bull. That is the account that got repeated everywhere, and the Oxford English Dictionary, which revised its entries in 2022, now doubts it. The spelling with a Z seems to predate the spelling with an S. An 1881 obituary crediting a German immigrant named Louis Albert Wagner with coining it may well be apocryphal. What is not in doubt is what it meant and how fast it traveled. By the last day of January 1877, a New Orleans paper was casually describing Sulla and Julius Caesar as prominent bulldozers of ancient Rome. 10 weeks. That is all it took for a lynching term to become a normal English word for pushing people around. Now the other problem, the physical one. Before the machine, dirt moved by hand and by mule. Men shoveled it into carts. In the sandy soil of California's San Joaquin Valley, farmers dragged crude wooden buck scrapers behind teams to cut irrigation ditches, and the ditches decided whether the valley ate. A Scottish immigrant wheelwright in Fresno named James Porteous spent the early 1880s fixing that. His answer, perfected by 1883, was a C-shaped steel bowl that scooped soil up instead of shoving it ahead and dumped it at a depth the operator controlled by lifting a handle. It quadrupled what a man with a shovel could do. 2 horses pulled it. It cost $28. They called it the Fresno. Nearly every bulldozer blade on Earth descends from that bowl. Then Benjamin Holt put a continuous track under a tractor in 1904 so it would float on soft ground instead of sinking. And in 1917, the Russell Grader Manufacturing Company of Minnesota ran an item in its catalog. It called a bulldozer. It was a steel blade dragged by mules. The word had already crawled onto machinery, and all it meant there was the thing that shoves. Then Morrowville, Kansas, 1923. A young farmer named James Cummings had won a contract to backfill a pipeline trench and had no good way to do it. A draftsman named J. Earl McLeod drew what he needed. A scraper blade hung off the front of a farm tractor on a pair of pivoting arms linked to the sides. They filed on December 18, 1923. On January 6, 1925, they received United States patent number 1,522,378 under the deliberately boring title Attachment for Tractors. A replica still sits in the city park. It worked. It was also almost useless, and nobody yet called it what we call it. The blade could not be raised. It could not be lowered. It could not be tilted. To change anything, the operator climbed down off the tractor into the dirt and adjusted it by hand with a wrench. That is the machine that would flatten the 20th century. What fixed it was money and iron. On April 15, 1925, in Stockton, California, the Holt Manufacturing Company and the C.L. Best Tractor Company merged into the Caterpillar Tractor Company. On December 4, 1928, Caterpillar made its first acquisition in company history, Russell Grader. They bought the blades, the graders, the factory, and, without noticing, the word. By 1929, you could buy 3 shapes of it: a U-blade to carry dirt a long way, a straight blade to knock piles down and spread them, a brush rake to tear out roots. Lay Plant Choate of Cedar Rapids, Iowa, was among the first to sell the things commercially, and its blades cut the Dixie Highway through Kentucky. And then there is the man who mattered more than any of them. Robert Gilmore LeTourneau was born in Vermont and started a land-clearing outfit in Stockton after the First World War. He would die holding 299 patents. He cut the Boulder Highway that made Hoover Dam possible. He built the Santiago Dam in Orange County, at the time the largest earth-fill dam ever built. Stand next to one of his jobs in 1930, and here is what you get: the smell of hot oil and scorched clutch, a flat plate of steel bending visibly under load, and a noise that arrives in your chest before your ears. He is the reason that plate stopped being a plate. Under LeTourneau, the blade became curved, box section reinforced, heat-treated, shaped so that rock rolled ahead of it in a wave instead of piling up and stalling the machine. Every bulldozer blade you have ever seen is his geometry. He was also, by his own account, not working alone. LeTourneau believed he engineered in partnership with God. God, he said, is the chairman of my board. He eventually gave away 90% of his company stock. He flew roughly 200,000 miles a year in his own plane and sometimes carried a professional gospel quartet aboard so they could sing to whatever town he landed in. And around 1930, quietly, the word jumped again. It stopped meaning the blade. It started meaning the whole thing, tractor and steel and diesel together. Nobody voted on it. Nobody objected. The machine did not choose its name. It inherited one that had been sitting loaded for half a century. Except that hardly anyone was buying. Widespread acceptance of the thing did not arrive until the middle of the 1930s. The country was broke, the machine was expensive, and Caterpillar had just told LeTourneau no. The doubt was not superstition. It was arithmetic. A contractor in 1933 had mules that ate and machines that cost. The blade still had no hydraulics. You raised it with a cable and dropped it with gravity, and if you wanted it at an angle, you got out and moved it yourself. A lot of men looked at that and looked at their mules and kept their mules. LeTourneau's answer came in 1937, flat on his back, recovering from a car wreck. He designed a self-propelled scraper driven by his own invention, an electric wheel with the motor built into the hub. He needed a 2-wheeled tractor unit to pull it. He took the idea to Caterpillar, the biggest tractor company in America. Caterpillar said no, so he built it himself and went head-to-head with them. Within 20 years, every competitor he had, Caterpillar included, had copied the layout. He was right. They knew it. Then the clock started. On December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft hit Pearl Harbor, and the United States Navy discovered a legal problem with its own construction crews. Under international law, a civilian who shoots back is a guerrilla, and a guerrilla can be executed on the spot. The Navy had civilian builders scattered across the Pacific. On December 28th, Rear Admiral Ben Morrell requested authority to militarize them. On January 5, 1942, he got it. Construction battalions, CBCBs, men who could pour concrete and kill you. Behind them, the factories opened. Toccoa in Georgia, Rydalmere in Australia, Vicksburg in Mississippi. Before the war ended, LeTourneau's plants would build roughly 70% of all the earth-moving equipment the Allies used. 8,000 scrapers, 14,000 dozer blades. More than half of the 1,500-mile Alaska highway was cut with his machines. A machine built to smooth ground for planting was about to be handed to men trained to fight. On the morning of October 27, 1943, 8 of those men landed on an island called Mono, with 2 bulldozers and a jeep. Mono is the largest of the Treasury Islands, in the Solomons, and it mattered for one reason. Bougainville was 28 miles north, and you could not take Bougainville without it. Company A of Naval Construction Battalion 87 came ashore within an hour of the first assault wave, attached to the 8th New Zealand Brigade, with orders to cut a road along the jungle beach. They landed into a fight. Mortars, machine guns, men going down on the sand, and dug in near the landing ship, well concealed and strongly built, sat a Japanese pillbox with a cannon and machine guns in it, sweeping the beach and stopping the unloading coal. Nothing was moving. Nothing could move. Lieutenant Charles E. Turnbull of the Civil Engineer Corps looked at the pillbox. Then he looked at a 20-ton Caterpillar D8 and the man sitting on it. Machinist's mate, second class, Aurelio Tassone, 28 years old. Turnbull gave the order. Tassone raised the blade in front of his own body so that 8 feet of steel stood between him and the guns and drove straight at the pillbox. Turnbull walked beside the tracks with a carbine, firing. Rounds hammered the blade. The D8 ground forward at the speed of a man walking, which is the only speed it had, coral crunching under the tracks, the exhaust stack barking. At the signal, Tassone dropped the blade. It came down with such force it nearly stalled the engine. The Silver Star citation says the position was silenced and 12 of the enemy inside it were annihilated. Tassone, interviewed later by the historian Francesca Rossello Amon, said the blade went through the obstruction like it was going through snowdrifts. Then he did the thing that makes this moment impossible to shake. He backed off and he bladed earth over the wreckage, back and forth, until the ground was flat and smooth. Then he went back to building the road. Both men received the Silver Star. It is very likely the first recorded instance of a bulldozer being used deliberately to kill people. The war took the lesson and ran. In 1944, Colonel K.S. Anderson of the Army Corps of Engineers wrote that of all the weapons of war, the bulldozer stands first. Not the plane, not the tank. Islands were so glutted with machines that when one broke down, the CB simply pushed it into the ocean and started another. And in Puerto Rico, a Navy man named Theodore Sturgeon spent 70-hour weeks in 120-degree heat clearing ground for an airstrip. He said he fell in love with that machine. Then he went home to New York and, in a 9-day writing frenzy, produced a novella about a bulldozer possessed by a demon that murders the men clearing an island. He called it Killdozer. It ran in Astounding in 1944. The machine had been at war for 2 years, and it already had a horror story. Tassone came home a hero. So did the machine. And America had a continent it wanted flattened. The war taught a generation that no landscape was permanent. Anything could be provisional. In California in the late 1950s, an orange tree was bulldozed, on average, every 55 seconds. Cities that had never been bombed began to look like cities that had. In New York, Robert Moses drew lines. Marshall Berman was a boy in the Bronx, and he later wrote that opposing Moses felt like opposing history itself. so nobody did. Then, in 1953, the machines arrived at his door for the Cross-Bronx Expressway. Something like 60,000 people, Jewish, Italian, Irish, Black, were put out of their homes to make room for it. Berman kept going back to the sites after the evictions, sometimes to weep, sometimes to marvel at how fast an ordinary nice neighborhood became spectacular ruins, both at once, standing in the dust of his own street. Nobody in the Bronx in 1953 heard the echo, a word invented to describe men forcing families out of their homes, bolted now to a machine forcing families out of their homes. Same syllables. Nobody flinched. Then the jungle. In 1953, LeTourneau flew over the Peruvian Amazon and saw rolling hills that looked to him like waves in a vast green sea, and he felt giddy. He built a town there and called it Tournevista, a bulldozer utopia with a church and a Bible school, staffed by men he called technical missionaries. His dozers were ants against 200-foot hardwoods. So he built something bigger, the Jungle Crusher, 74 feet long, 280,000 pounds, which reared up on its back roller like a dinosaur and came down on ancient trees with a crash you could hear from a mile off. He claimed it could clear an acre in half an hour. Tournevista failed. The rain came. The vegetation grew back faster than he could cut it. The town today dates its own founding to 1984, 15 years after he died, and will not discuss him. But the 1950s are when machine-led clearing of the South American rainforest began. That never stopped. 80 years on, the machine has not changed its habits. It has only gotten better at them, and it has learned to file the paperwork first. Caterpillar took in about $67 billion in 2025 and employs roughly 118,000 people. A D9 stands as tall as a double-decker bus and weighs around 54 tons. The blade alone weighs about as much as an Asian elephant. The company's chief technology officer says there are over 4 million Caterpillar assets running worldwide, and 1.4 million of them are connected, trackable, monitored around the clock, right down to how a particular operator works the clutch. And the old meaning came back. In India in 2024 alone, an investigation by the magazine Frontline counted at least 7,407 houses demolished in state-led eviction drives, leaving more than 41,000 people homeless, until the Indian Supreme Court ruled in November 2024 that no one's home may be destroyed merely because they stand accused of a crime. Here is the part nobody sees coming. In 1954, LeTourneau went to a small Texas oil outfit with a proposition. He would build, at his own expense, a floating platform with 3 lattice legs that could jack itself up above the waves, drill, and then move to the next well. The legs would be raised and lowered by the same electric drives he had built for his earth-moving machines. If it failed, he would tow it home and eat the cost. On March 20, 1956, at Galveston, LeTourneau handed a 3-foot key, the key to the Gulf, to the president of Zapata Offshore Company. The rig was christened Scorpion. The president's name was George Bush. 3 months later, Scorpion set a world record, moving roughly a mile under tow to a new site and drilling again within 8.5 hours. Today, about 360 jack-up rigs are working around the world, every one of them a descendant of that design. And offshore fields supply close to 30% of the planet's crude oil. The offshore oil industry is a bulldozer part, a word for a man with a whip, bolted to a blade for filling a ditch, ended up drilling the ocean floor and putting a future American president in business. Look at the whole run of it. It started as a steel bowl for cutting irrigation ditches in Fresno sand, $28, 2 horses. It became a blade, a Kansas farmer hung on a tractor to backfill a pipeline. It picked up a name that was already 50 years of American violence. It won a war on an island called Mono and buried 12 men and smoothed the ground over them. It flattened the Bronx. It flattened the Amazon. It jacked a platform out of the Gulf of Mexico and handed the key to a man who would become president. It is running somewhere right now. And somewhere right now, a person is standing in front of one, holding paperwork, trying to be heard over the engine. You started this, thinking you'd been handed a coincidence. A funny, ugly accident of etymology, the kind of thing you learn and repeat at a bar. It was not an accident. Language had a slot open. A slot for a thing that arrives, refuses to negotiate, and leaves flat ground where your life used to be. For 47 years, the only things that fit in that slot were people. The word came first. The machine spent the next 100 years earning it. If this one got you, drop a like, and tell me in the comments which part you didn't see coming. The pillbox, the orange trees, or the oil rig. Subscribe, and I'll keep digging these up.